Hi, Darian. This is Ira. I'm recording here my feedback on your statement of belief. And so, what I'll be doing is offering some of my read along comments in hopes that some of those may be useful as you move from this statement of belief to your more full theoretical articulation of good argument in the next assignment. So, starting off, I think your first point, you maybe know this, is itself a common rhetorical point, which is essentially that what counts as good depends on its location. I think that's fair enough, and I think that your decision to restrict yourself in this essay just to higher stakes arguments is perfectly reasonable. I'd be interested, though, to see you thinking a little bit more about whether there's a homology between goodness in high stakes argument and in low stakes argument. So that might be an interesting homology means a similarity of logic, whether the two goodness in both cases has the same logic to it, or if there's really truly some separate logic for high stakes versus low stakes arguments. So it just might be interesting to explore that a little bit more as you move forward. I think it's helpful that you start off essentially by asking about good argument in terms of what it accomplishes. So here you're taking an effects sort of framework as your way of thinking about goodness, and within that effects framework, you're distinguishing between the truly good and the merely effective. I wonder, though, does goodness in an argument require effects? So here you say it furthers our understanding. Can an argument that doesn't further somebody's understanding, but that ought to have, still be good? What about cases where one's audience or one's interlocutor is so fundamentally or deeply opposed to engaging that their understanding can't be furthered or can't be shifted? Or what about when you yourself are too so deeply opposed to understanding the other that your position can't be shifted at all? Is good argument possible under those conditions? If so, what would it look like? If not, why not? What makes the consequences the right spot to start our definition of good argument? Why does the content or internal consistency of the argument, why is it contained totally by the value of the consequences? And then you offer a few different takes on how arguments can be effective but not good. They don't make their opposers intellectually better off. And so this is really, I think the core of your definition, as I take it here, is that the well-being of the one persuaded by good argument is, in fact, in some way improved. So I'd be interested to hear you say more about what it means for the well-being of the one persuaded by good argument to be improved. In other words, so let's say I change my mind and I now have a correct opinion, but I live in just the same way that I did. Am I better off intellectually or not? Do I also have to change the way I live my life? What about situations where there's no immediate implication, these lower stakes situations? So that are maybe not simply subjective, but are not clearly going to cash out in our day-to-day lives. So like an argument about, a contested moment in 11th century history, right? One can be intellectually better off, but have no real consequences for how one lives one's life. Is that good enough to be? Can that count as high stakes? Is that really just low stakes? I think it's interesting that once you start with consequences, then you come back to actually say that how good argument is created is really important. And then you say that how it's created has to rest in indisputable evidence. And I want to kind of challenge you a little bit on that, because aren't we often induced to change our minds in ways that make us better by evidence that certainly isn't indisputable? I mean, arguably, there are very few instances in the world where evidence is truly indisputable. It also seems to hinge a lot on, again, who your audience is. So, I mean, I certainly, in a broad strokes, we can say there's flimsy or poorly sourced evidence somewhere over the thin, narrow line between good evidence and bad evidence. There's lots of bad evidence over that line. But what about close to the line? What makes evidence acceptable or good enough, even if it's not perhaps indisputable, which seems like a very high bar? Or if you want to keep indisputable as a bar, how does your definition work with the fact that lots of times we are persuaded, and in ways that we probably think are better, by evidence that we don't think is indisputable, i.e. it's not certain with the kind of compellingness of a mathematical proof. So here, when you're talking about really persuading a person into changing their personal identity, you talk about the need to actually make the person opposing your claim actually understand and believe that evidence. And this is how you talk about its indisputability. But I wonder about this. Must your opponent really believe in your evidentiary support just as much as you do? In other words, isn't enough that they believe in it enough and maybe arrive at your conclusion for reasons that are not 100% identical with yours? Can that still be good? So if I take myself to, any number of times I've been persuaded by arguments that I didn't really buy all of the pieces of the argument. But on the whole, and given my own thinking about it in a few other ways, I found myself changing my mind, and ultimately for the better. And I think that speaks to a lot of different parts of life where it's really hard to nail down what actually is indisputably the case. So I'd be interested to see how you would tighten this up a little bit by loosening it up a little bit. In other words, how you might make it better able to account for the range of circumstances where we might think good argument on your earlier definition would be the right way of thinking about those circumstances, and how you might do that by thinking about what it means to be persuaded in situations where we don't take the evidentiary support to be indisputable, or we don't adhere to it at the same level as our interlocutor. So when you're talking about this, part of what you say, my only caution is that the evidence must be tangible to the person on the receiving end of your argument. So the challenge becomes how to make these experiences something that can be universally understood by everyone receiving this argument. And that's really tricky, because what about the many cases where this is to kind of come back to my earlier question, where there simply are some audiences that will not engage? And I really want to push you to say either good argument is in fact impossible in those cases, in which case, what are we going to do with that? Or to say good argument is possible in those cases, and thus I have to tweak this somewhat. And I'd be interested in either of those outcomes or some other way of addressing those cases that I'm not thinking about right now. So I want to be clear. I don't need you to go in one or another direction, but I'm challenging you to bring your ideal case theory in more frictional contact with the trickiness of many of our audiential considerations. So for instance, actually, and this is a great example. So we live in a society structured by racism, absolutely, totally. And that's fairly easy for you and I to talk about because we both already regard the reality at the base of the assertion as indisputable. But for the person who doesn't have a way of framing those realities as the case, so in other words, the person who says that our results in life are primarily the product of individual striving. Anybody who sees the world that way and believes that to be the case, rather than thinking that it's much more of a mixed bag, is going to have a really hard time taking seriously systematic racism. I would agree with you. You and I think would probably agree that person's wrong, but that person has a set of beliefs about how the world works that you think are wrong. And that set of beliefs, I wonder if there's really any way for that whole set of beliefs to be dislodged by an argument about systematic racism, since the way that the strong evidence is understood gets framed by the pre-existing beliefs. And given that that's the case in a lot of situations, this is why I kind of find myself wanting to push you to say, well, there must be some ways of making good arguments even where we can't realistically hope to persuade our audience. Or again, are there not? Especially because some of this, right? So if you want to not alienate those whom you're seeking to persuade, you really are in a bind. So if somebody has a set of beliefs that you disagree with profoundly, and that set of beliefs influences how they receive what you present as evidence, you're going to have to ask them to change those beliefs as well, or else they won't receive your evidence in the way that it's intended. And you may be right, you might be wrong in some larger metaphysical sense, but argumentatively, there's no moving forward without some give in the space of beliefs. And that give in the space of beliefs, although in general I actually quite agree, and I mean I try to make my arguments in ways that mostly don't alienate people, it's nonetheless the case that if you want people to give way in the space of beliefs, you're going to have to alienate them some. There's something alienating about being asked to see the world differently. So I'd be interested to hear you talk a little bit more about what kinds of alienation of an audience are good or appropriate or acceptable, and what kinds are not, and why. Kind of skip a little bit forward here because I want to think. I think you really make a good point when you say, I do not believe there's one kind of vocabulary or set of terms that leads to a perfect argument, but you do believe good arguments are able to, one, identify their audience, and two, contain itself, the argument, I assume, within the linguistic bounds that realization creates. So good argument is fundamentally oriented towards an audience in a context. So I'd like to see you trace out the consequences of that idea a little more systematically for what you think about good argument in cases where a deeper persuasion may in fact not be possible. And I think you say something interesting about this right at the end. You say, ultimately, I do not think good arguments should necessarily need to try very hard to persuade their audience. A good argument need only present information in an accessible way. This is almost opposite to where you started. So you started with a sense that good argument requires that the audience be intellectually improved in some way. Here, really what's at stake is all on the side of the arguer. And I think that there's a really interesting and important tension there, and I look forward to hearing you explain.